Hello everyone and welcome back. In a previous video, I showed you how you could make requests to an API as a client. The two examples I went through were how to use the iTunes Search API and how to use a machine learning predictor API that I created. The code for the latter is shown here in VS Code. So we imported the request library and the JSON library to help us out. We constructed a URL. This URL is making a request to my simple machine learning app that is deployed as a Heroku app using the Heroku cloud provider. It has an endpoint /predict. This endpoint expects 4 query arguments, one for the level of the candidate, one for the language of the candidate, one for whether the candidate tweets or not, and one for the PhD of the candidate, and returns true if this candidate interviewed well and false if the candidate did not interview well. How my API does this is by using this decision tree in order to make classifications given the passed-in arguments. If you're interested in learning more about how I use this code here in order to make client requests to my, I'll call it interview predictor app on Heroku, take a look at my previous video. The purpose of this video is to show you how to do the server side. So here I've got the code from the client side to make requests, given values, attribute values for an unseen instance. How can we get a prediction back? Now I'm going to show you how do we make the prediction to begin with? How do we set up a web app that has this predict endpoint? How do we set it up to parse out these 4 query arguments? Using these 4 query arguments, run them through a decision tree to get a classification, and then package up that classification as a JSON response that the client can then parse through. All right, let's get started. So first, I'm going to make a new file, and I'll note that I'm in a project directory here called API Service Fun. This is in opposition to my previous video where I was working in a directory called API Client Fun. I did copy over the interview predictor to API Service Fun because it will be useful for testing our new service that we're going to set up. All right, so let's call this new Python file interviewapp.py. Interviewapp.py. All right, so I'm going to start with some notes here. First, I want to say that in order to set up an API, we essentially have to set up a web app. And a web app requires a web framework. And there are a lot of options out there for web frameworks. Since I'm doing this video series in Python, we're going to use a Python web framework. The 2 most popular Python web frameworks are Django and Flask. Django is a more fully featured web framework than Flask, which is more lightweight. In fact, Flask is called a micro web framework because it is super lightweight. That doesn't mean it's not functional though. Flask, out of the box, can accomplish the basics of what we need to set up an API, and it also has an extensive extension system where you can simply add extensions to do additional things. Like, for example, if you want to add support for working with databases, you can add a SQL extension. Or if you want to format your HTML web pages using Bootstrap and more advanced styling, you can add a Bootstrap extension. So I'm going to write here, we're going to use a micro web framework called Flask. Flask is going to allow us to, with only a few lines of code, get this predictor API up and running. But like I said, it is a micro web framework, but take a look at some of the extensions before you write it off as perhaps not being featured enough for maybe a production app you're trying to build. All right, our goal is to create a web app for our simple predict API service. Let's get started. We're going to import from the Flask library, the capital F Flask class. If you aren't using Python distribution that contains Flask, then you'll likely need to install this. So simply running pip install Flask should do what you need to do. All right, we then make a Flask web app by invoking the initializer for the Flask class to make a Flask object. And by convention, you pass in dunder name dunder to the initializer. And dunder name dunder pretty much represents the name of the module. If this module interview app.py is executed directly from command line, then dunder name dunder is going to be equal to dunder main dunder. So you've probably seen this before at the bottom of Flask module, or excuse me, Python modules, where there's a check to see, okay, if dunder name dunder equals dunder main dunder, then that means that this interview app.py file was executed directly, like from command line, Python space interview app.py. If this module was imported from another module, then dunder name dunder will be the name of the module interview app.py. So passing this in to the Flask initializer provides Flask with some information about this module and about the current working directory. All right, so we are going to be invoking our Flask app directly. So we will be running Python space interview app.py from command line. So that means that this if statement on line 8 will evaluate to true, and we are going to run our app. Now, since we are just beginning to develop our app, I'm going to pass in a flag to flask-app.run to set debug to true. Setting debug to true is really nice because if our app crashes, Flask will try to show the stack trace in the browser so we can hunt down the bug. And it's also nice because it's going to utilize what's called a reloader. And every time we make a change to interview app.py and save the change, Flask is going to reload the app without us having to kill the web app and then restart it again manually. I want to make one note here, though, before we move on, which is a to-do. And the to-do is this. Set debug to false. Wow. I cannot type today. Set debug to false before deployment. Debug set to true should only be set for development purposes only. When you're ready to deploy this to the public on a web server, you should definitely set debug to false. All right, we could run our Flask app now, but it would just run and we wouldn't be able to interact with it really. So let's wait to run it until we've added our first route. So time now to talk about routes. We're actually going to add 2 routes. The first one we're going to add is a route for the home page. Okay, we don't really need a home page route to build our API. We're really only interested in building the predict route. But building a home page route is a nice way to get started working with Flask. So let's do that first. So what is a route? So a route is a path on a server to a function that handles the request to this path. So it's essentially the glue between the path on the server and a Python function that's going to handle the request to that path. So let's add our first route. So I'm going to have @app.route, and then the first thing I put in this route is the path. So if we're thinking about a home page for a website, like for example, google.com, okay, it seems like there's no path on the end, right? Google.com, there's nothing like /predict after it. But there is actually just a single slash, which is used to represent the root page, right? Or the root path. So the home page is represented by a single slash for the path. And this home page is also called the index because it's the index page for your website. By default, all routes only handle GET requests unless you specify other methods that should be handled by this route with the methods argument. So by default, they're all just handling GET requests. But if you needed to handle another request, like say a post, then you could put post in this list here. We're only going to be working with GET requests for now. So this entire part of my route decorator here is optional since, like I said, by default, a route only handles GET requests. All right, I just called this whole line here, line 11, a decorator, and it's used by Python and Flask specifically in this case to decorate a function, which means provide some additional information about the function to be used by Python in the library. So now below it, we need to specify the function that should execute when this request is routed to this function. So I'm going to call this function index, but I could call it anything I want as long as it's a valid Python function name. So I could call it homepage if I wanted to, my app index, root path index, etc. All right, so here we need to return content and a request code. If you think about a homepage for a website, you're thinking of HTML, right? Your browser, for example, let's say I go back to iTunes. Your browser receives HTML when it makes a GET request to this URL here, and it takes that HTML and it renders it nicely so that we can see it and read it easily as humans. So let's see how we can start to do this with the homepage of our web app. So we're going to return as our content HTML. I'm simply going to return a level 1 header that I'll say, welcome to my app inside of, and then I'll have a closing tag for that level 1 header. Then I'll have my, did I say request code? Should be response code. Then I'll have my response code, which is 200. So I'm returning essentially a tuple with two values. One is HTML content that my browser will render, and then 200 is a response code denoting, okay, this is successful. All right, with just a few lines of code, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so, we are able to have a simple web app that serves up a home page. So now we're ready to run our Flask app. You can run your Flask app in VS Code by clicking the green play button, using your keyboard shortcut for running the Python file, or coming down to your terminal here and launching interviewapp.py from command line. I'll do the latter approach here. So I'm going to invoke Python interviewapp.py. So I've got some output showing down here in my terminal. Let's go through a few of the important pieces of this output. First, it says serving Flask app interview app. And then I've got a warning here that says this is a development server. Do not use it in a production deployment. Use a production WSGI server instead. So essentially what this is saying is Flask is a microweb framework that comes with a development web server, which is essentially a process that's used in order to manage the web framework. Well, this development server is not fully featured. And if you're using this video as a stepping stone to learning how to build production Python web servers, then you should take a look at using a WSGI or a gUnicorn server instead. But if you're using it just to get started and you just want to deploy a simple Flask app, like I'm going to do in this video, then this development server is going to be just fine for our purposes. But like I said, you should heed this advice and take a look at WSGI or gUnicorn servers instead if you're going to use this in a true production environment. All right. Next, it says debug mode is on, and then it says running on HTTP://127.0.0.1 port 5000. Okay. If you are using VS Code and you're connected to a Docker container like I am, then you'll probably want to click follow link using forwarded port in order to open this up in your web browser. Or you'll see a little pop-up here that'll say that this port is automatically forwarded from your container to your host machine. That's awesome. If you're not using VS Code connected to a Docker container, then ignore everything I just said, and you should be able to just copy and paste this URL into your favorite web browser. All right, so here it is. Welcome to my app. It looks like our index route is successfully mapping requests to our /, our root path, to our index function, which is returning this level 1 header. Now, what is nice about debug mode, amongst many things, one thing is, let's say I change my Flask app. I'll put some exclamation marks on this HTML I'm returning, and I'll save this. You can see the output says, detected a change, reloading. And I don't have to kill my Python application and rerun it. I can simply refresh my request, meaning make a new request from Chrome as a client, and I'll see updated output return. So that's one nice thing about debug set to true. When you're done running your Flask app, you can just hit Control-C at your terminal in order to kill it. All right, so just to recap, we have set up one route, which is essentially a glue between a path on a server to a function that executes when a client makes a request to that path. Our route supports GET requests to the root path, and it returns a simple HTML string that says, welcome to my app, that is rendered by our browser when status code 200 is received. All right, this is awesome. This is a nice stepping stone for getting towards building our predict endpoint. So now let's build our predict endpoint. So we're gonna have a route for predict. So at app.route/predict is going to be our path. And then once again, just to be verbose, I'm gonna say this route only supports GET requests. I can call my function that is decorated with this route using any name I want as long as it's a valid Python function name. So I'll just call it predict. And the goal for predict is threefold. So first, we want to be able to parse out the level, language, tweets, and PhD arguments from the query string. Then we want to be able to take those values and make a prediction using a decision tree. That's the machine learning part here. We're trying to deploy this model so we can use it. And then lastly, we want to return the prediction as a JSON response. I'm not going to do these goals in this order. If I were to give numbers to them, let's say 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to do 3, 1, 2. Let's start with 3. We've already seen how we can return content and a response code where the content was HTML. Now let's see how we can return content when the content is JSON. So our goal is to return back a JSON object, which we know from our interview predictor is really a dictionary. So let's have a dictionary called result that's going to store the key prediction and its value, which I'm going to hard code to be true right now. Goal number 2 is going to use the tree to make a prediction, but for now I can just hard code it to be true, and we can continue on with building our predict endpoint. So this is my JSON object as a dictionary that I want to return. So to return this, I'm going to use a little utility function from Flask called JSONify and return the request code, 200. So JSONify is a utility function from Flask that I'll need to import. And essentially what it does is it takes a dictionary like result and it creates a JSON string from it. This JSON string is going to be the body of the response that Flask is going to return from our predict endpoint by packaging up our status code and our JSON body. I'll remind you that in our interview predictor.py, our client code, we were loading that JSON response, which is a string from response.txt, into a dictionary using the JSON.loads function. All right, so here's building that JSON string, and then here is parsing that JSON string into a JSON object, which is a dictionary. All right, so this is the basics of 3, returning a JSON response. Let's save this and then head over to our URL and add the predict endpoint on the end. So you can see that the body of our message that we're getting back from the API is this JSON string, which Google Chrome is simply rendering as a web page, meaning it's just showing the raw content. And I do want to make one note here, okay? This should be port 5000, but because I'm running from a Docker container, VS Code is forwarding that port on my behalf. So yours, if you're doing what I'm doing with VS Code, might be different. If you're not doing the remote containers extension in VS Code, this should be 5000. All right, great. Let's move on to goal number 1 then. Ideally, the candidate or the client is going to have a query string where they pass in arguments like level equal to junior. So we want to see how with Flask we can extract this key and its value. To do this, we're going to import request from Flask. So request is an identifier that refers to a request object that stores all the information for the current request. So I can use the request object to get the current request's query arguments. So let's try and get level out. So I'm going to assign to a variable called level the return value from request.args, which is a dictionary. You see it says immutable multi-dictionary, .get, and then I can pass in the key. Well, level is going to be the key. And if level isn't a valid key in this dictionary, then let's simply assign to my level variable over here the empty string. So if a client ever fails to give me a level key value pair, then I'm simply going to store the empty string in level. Let's print it out, make the request again, and see if this works. And there it is, level is junior. If I change this, let's say level is senior, make the request again, then I get level is senior. Awesome, well let's grab the rest. So I'm gonna have one for language, one for tweets, and one for PhD. Now I could go to Google Chrome and I could add 3 more key value pairs to my query string separated by ampersands and see the predictions I get back. I could also head over to my interview predictor.py and I could replace this subdomain and domain with the special URL 127.0.0.1, which is an IP address. This refers to local host, which is always going to be my current machine or your current machine. And then port 5000, take off the S, okay? This is just running over plain HTTP protocol. I'm gonna add a new bash terminal in VS Code. I'm gonna save this, and then I'm going to run Python interview predictor.py, and I'm going to get a response back from my Flask app running on localhost, listening on port 5000. So that's pretty exciting. Okay, I can use my client code that I wrote for working with a Flask app that was deployed to the web on Heroku for testing my Flask app locally when I'm just developing it. All right. We just finished goal number 1. We'd already finished goal number 3. Now what's left is goal number 2, which is make a prediction using a decision tree. All right, I'm gonna hold off doing this in this video. I think we've covered a lot of ground so far, and I'm just gonna put a to-do here. Show later. I will show how to do this in a subsequent video, but this right now is essentially the basics of how to set up an endpoint for an API using Flask. I'll note that we're hard coding what we're returning, but this is a good start. I'll also note that the app right now is running on what's called localhost, our own local machine, and it's not up in the cloud. It's not up on the web yet. So that will also be what I'll show in a subsequent video later. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.